Imagine a place so vast and so indifferent to human life that it can swallow a person whole, leaving no trace. Imagine that a single, solitary figure, a man with a camera and a dream, disappears into that nothingness. Now, imagine a bizarre paradox. The one thing that should have been lost forever is found, 17 years later, perfectly preserved, but its discovery only deepens the terror. This is not a story of a desert adventure gone wrong, but the chilling tale of Julian Voss, a photographer swallowed by the Sahara, whose ghost returned in the form of his buried jeep, revealing a mystery far darker and more senseless than anyone could have ever imagined. It was a cold case that became a murder investigation not because of a body, but because of an absence. In the autumn of 2003, Julian Voss, a man in his early 30s, left his quiet life in Berlin for an expedition he had dreamed of for years. He was not a professional adventurer or a rugged survivalist. He was an artist, a photographer, with a profound fascination for the immense, unpopulated spaces of the world. The Sahara, in its infinite shifting emptiness, called to him. His plan was straightforward. Drive a specially outfitted jeep from Morocco, cross a less traveled expanse of the desert, and spend several weeks documenting the stark beauty of the dunes, the strange rock formations, and the interplay of light and shadow. He planned to send regular updates via satellite phone to his partner, a man named Lucas, who remained at their home, waiting with a mixture of excitement and low-grade anxiety. Julian had meticulously planned his route, packed more than enough food and water, and carried multiple navigation systems. He was prepared, but perhaps not for the kind of evil that could exist in such isolation. The first week of his journey was everything he had hoped for. The satellite phone calls were filled with wonder. He spoke of the silence, a silence so profound it felt like a physical presence. He told Lucas about the sun setting like a fiery coin sinking into the sand, and the stars that burned so brightly in the ink-black sky without the interference of any city lights. He described the immense scale of the landscape, saying it made him feel both utterly insignificant and completely free. His last communication came on October 18th, a brief message to Lucas that he had found the perfect spot for some nighttime photography. He promised he would call again in the morning, and said he had never felt more alive. Lucas waited for the next call, but it never came. He tried to call Julian, but the phone went straight to a dead signal. He told himself that perhaps a storm had affected the connection, or that Julian had simply moved to an area without coverage. But after a day of silence, a creeping dread took root. The alarm was officially raised by Lucas on October 20th. He contacted the German embassy, which then coordinated with local authorities in Morocco and neighboring Algeria. The search operation that followed was a monumental effort against an impossible adversary. Ground crews with experienced desert guides were dispatched, and small planes were hired to fly grids over the region where Julian was believed to be. The team searched for tire tracks, for any sign of a vehicle, or for a flash of color against the tan and ochre landscape. Days turned into weeks. The search radius expanded. The vastness of the Sahara became the most significant obstacle. It was like trying to find a single grain of sand on a beach that stretched for 1,000 miles. A person could walk 100 yards from a vehicle and disappear forever in the featureless expanse. Investigators considered every initial theory. Was it an accident? Had the jeep broken down? Had Julian gotten lost while taking a photograph, succumbed to dehydration, and simply been swallowed by the dunes? But none of these theories held up to logical scrutiny. Julian was an experienced driver, and his vehicle was in perfect working order before the trip. He had a full complement of spare parts and emergency supplies. There was no record of any distress signal from his satellite phone. There was no sign of a crash. The most plausible and yet terrifying possibility was that he had simply vanished without a trace, leaving behind no evidence of what had befallen him. The search continued for another month, slowly diminishing in size and intensity. Eventually, with no new leads and no physical evidence, the operation was called off. The case of Julian Voss was reclassified from a search and rescue to a missing person case, filed away as another tragic victim of the desert's unforgiving nature. For his family and Lucas, there was no closure, only an endless, agonizing question mark. 8 years passed. the world moved on, but for Lucas, the memory of Julian's disappearance remained a constant ache. The case was completely cold. Then, a peculiar piece of evidence surfaced. An Algerian tourist vacationing near the edge of the desert discovered an old, tattered journal buried under a rock. The journal was not Julian's, but it contained a single, blurry photograph tucked between its pages. The photograph, taken from a great distance, showed a lone, silhouetted figure in the desert holding what appeared to be a small, shiny object. It was impossible to tell what the object was or who the person was, but the background of the image showed a jeep, partially obscured by a dune. The vehicle appeared to be Julian's. The tourist, having heard the persistent local legends of the lost German photographer, had turned the journal over to the authorities. The find briefly reignited hope, and a new, limited search was launched, but it proved to be as futile as the first. The photo was too indistinct, the location too vast. The jeep was never found. The image remained a chilling enigma, suggesting that Julian had not been alone, but it provided no answers. The case again went cold. The trail had gone dry, buried under the unblinking sun and the endless shifting sands. Another 9 years passed, a total of 17 years since Julian Voss had disappeared. The world had largely forgotten the story. Then, in a remote, desolate corner of the Sahara, a team of French geologists was conducting a survey. The weather had been unusually fierce, a massive sandstorm having scoured the landscape for days, moving vast quantities of sand that had lain undisturbed for decades. The geologists were driving along a newly exposed stretch of hard desert floor, when their lead vehicle's tires suddenly bounced over something metallic. They stopped and began to dig. What they found was both a miracle and a horror. It was the jeep. It was mostly buried, but the top was visible. It was Julian's jeep, and it was in an astonishing state of preservation. The paint was faded, but the vehicle was largely intact, its tires deflated but otherwise solid. A collective gasp of hope went through the team as they wondered if Julian might still be inside, a mummified remains. But the hope was short-lived. The jeep was empty. The authorities were notified, and a forensic team was flown to the remote location. What they discovered inside the vehicle defied logic. The jeep's gas tank was full. The ignition key was in the on position. The interior was a pristine tableau of Julian's last moments. There was a water bottle in the cup holder, half full. A packet of dates lay open on the passenger seat. His camera bag was on the floor, and inside it were lenses, spare batteries, and a single, carefully wrapped camera body. The main camera, the one he would have been using for his photography, was not there. Most bizarrely, the vehicle's battery was completely disconnected. The terminals were clean, and the nuts were loosened, as if someone had deliberately removed the power. The scene was too tidy, too deliberate. The initial theory of a simple accident or getting lost was shattered. This was not the end of a trip. It was the abrupt and intentional termination of a journey. The case was officially reopened and reclassified as a homicide investigation. The forensic experts meticulously processed the scene. They dusted every surface of the jeep, every piece of equipment, and every spare part. The sand around the jeep was also sifted through. The most critical discovery was a set of fingerprints on the disconnected battery terminal. They did not match Julian's. They ran the prints through every available database, but they came up empty. They were a ghost in the system, a set of prints belonging to a man who had no digital footprint. They also found a faint boot print in the compacted sand beside the driver's side door, its pattern distinct from Julian's boots. It was a new clue, but without a name to go with it, it was another dead end. They interviewed the geologists and the local nomadic tribes who had roamed the area, but no one had seen anything suspicious. The investigators were at a complete loss. They had the crime scene, but they had no victim and no suspect. The investigative pivot came from a detective who was re-examining the original cold case file. He focused on the only other piece of physical evidence, the blurry photograph of the man holding the shiny object. He had the image digitally enhanced and magnified. The shiny object was a spanner. The Jeep was positioned in a particular way that suggested it was being worked on. The detective then used geographical data from Julian's last satellite phone call to triangulate a small, specific area of the desert where Julian had been. He cross-referenced this with local maps and old reports from the original search. The only thing of note in that entire God-forsaken area was an old, isolated well, a rare and precious resource for the few people who lived in the region. The well was maintained by a local man known only as Elias. Elias was a local legend, a recluse who lived in a small, self-built compound near the well. He had a reputation for being eccentric and secretive. He was known to have a profound dislike for outsiders, believing they polluted the desert he considered his own. He was a loner, paranoid, and territorial. The original search party had spoken to him, but he had offered no information, claiming he had seen no one. The new team of detectives decided to pay him a visit. His compound was a dilapidated collection of structures, filled with junk and various tools. It was a bizarre, almost museum-like place. When they arrived, Elias was hostile but compliant, saying he had nothing to hide. But the investigators noticed a flicker of panic in his eyes when they asked about Julian. Law enforcement obtained a search warrant. The raid on Elias's compound was methodical and thorough. They found nothing at first, but one detective, a man with a keen eye for detail, noticed a small, recently disturbed patch of dirt behind a lean-to. Underneath it was a locked metal box. They broke the lock and opened the box. Inside was a chilling collection of items. Julian's satellite phone, the batteries removed, his wallet, its cash and credit cards still inside, and the very camera that was missing from the Jeep, the one Julian had been using to take his photographs. The memory card was still inside. The final images on the card were a chronological nightmare. They showed the beauty of the desert, then a close-up of a well. The very last pictures were of a man standing next to the well, holding a large spanner. The man was Elias. The final photo was a blur, as if the camera had been dropped. Confronted with this irrefutable evidence, Elias finally confessed. The confession was delivered with a chilling lack of remorse. He said that he had seen Julian's Jeep approaching his well, and that Julian, a stranger in his domain, had dared to ask for water. He had gone into a fit of rage, telling the man that the water was his, and his alone. Julian had tried to argue, and Elias, blinded by his paranoid rage, had attacked him, killing him instantly. He then drove the Jeep a short distance away, disconnected the battery so it couldn't be tracked, and then dragged Julian's body for miles before burying it in a shallow grave he had covered with rocks. He claimed he intended to come back for the body later. But a sudden sandstorm had buried the Jeep, and he had simply left the body to decompose in the heat, believing he had gotten away with the perfect crime. He had taken Julian's phone and camera as trophies, keeping them in his little box of secrets. Elias was charged with first-degree murder. His trial was a grim and straightforward affair. The evidence was overwhelming. The fingerprints, the boot prints, the Jeep, the camera, and the unfeeling confession. There was no doubt as to his guilt. Elias was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His banal, hateful crime, a petty argument over water in a place where it was most precious, had ended a life and created a mystery that haunted a family for nearly 2 decades. Julian Voss, a hopeful man who only wanted to capture the beauty of the desert, had found instead its cruelest and most hidden monster. The Jeep, buried by the very force of nature Julian had come to admire, had held its secret for 17 long years, waiting for the wind to uncover the truth and reveal a cold-hearted killer whose motive was as trivial as it was terrifying. His death was not a tragedy of nature, but of human malevolence, a final, grim testament to the fact that even in the most remote corners of the earth, the greatest danger is often man himself,